Welcome back. We're going to do a panel discussion now with our speakers at this year's SAT Talks around the concept of metrics. We all know that we measure the things that matter to us the most. And what we want to talk with you today from our audience as well as our speakers here is the concept and what you're doing to measure the things that you're doing. And I've asked our speakers to be thinking of these three questions. What do you measure? Why do you measure that? And how do you measure it? And appreciate the opportunity to get some questions from you folks as well. So we have a couple of microphones that we can go back and forth. So I think what I'm going to start is ask one of them, and this is free for all. You can answer all three questions at the same time, or you can answer any one of those questions if you want to, and we can come back to you. So, Keith, you've got a microphone there. Start us off.
I think I'm on.
So, Keith Jaspers with the Rainbow Network. What do you measure? Why do you measure it? And how do you measure it?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of things that are objective and easy to count. And there's a lot of things that are subjective and difficult to keep track of. We know how many houses we built. We can count them. They're down the street there. We know how many people attend our grade schools, but it's very difficult for us to determine how much they're actually learning. We think that we've got somewhere around 35,000 kids who have learned to read and write and do basic math that would not have done so otherwise. But it's very difficult for us to prove that. It's very difficult to, you give a child an education, what effect does that have? How do you measure that in reality? So what we measure is attendance, participation. We know how many people participate in our lending programs and our community banks. We know how many people participate in the home building and how many people volunteer at various projects. We know how many students we have in high school, how many students we have in grade schools and from which communities, and we know what they're studying. We keep track of all of that. The results of that studying, I think, is very difficult to determine. Our doctors have a good count of what number of patients they treat and of the illnesses, but we don't keep a running tab on some of that just because sometimes it costs more money to gather and keep track of information than that information is valuable to us in the end. So it's possible to spend a lot of money on information gathering that, I don't want to say it's useless, but we probably wouldn't really use it to make decisions with. We know these people are sick. We know we're the only doctor in town. We know we've got the only medicines. We're going to treat them. So we keep track of general things, but not specifics, although the doctors will have individual files on each patient that they can look up should the need arise. Public health, again, is very abstract, very subjective. We do a lot of stuff with anti-parasite and safe drinking water and vaccinations and so forth. And some of that we keep track of, some of it we don't. It's just too subjective. Or we keep track of it by the community rather than by the person. So what
would you think? What would you say are one or two of the most important things, the most helpful things that you keep track of, and why? Obviously, well, I won't say obviously. What are a couple of the most important things that you track?
Well, what we really want to know is the interest of the community. Is the community participating? So we really want to know is how many people from a community are participating, generally speaking, in each of our programs, and to what level of interest. That's probably the number one. And then number two is we try to keep track of a general response to that. And if that community is really participating, maybe we've got 6 grade schools in that community, then we really want to, because that's the big thing, and then we really want to try to keep track of that a little more than we might be down the road or 100 miles away in another community.
Okay. Okay. So maybe I'm going to reframe the question so we can, we'll be able to get everybody in. So what's one of the most important things you track and why? So be thinking for a second. What's one of the most important things that you track and why? And while somebody's getting ready to answer that, any questions from out here? All right. So one of the most important things you track and why?
That's a difficult question, Tom, because
Okay.
it seems like there's so many things that are important.
All right.
At Hope International, we pretty much measure everything. We quantitative, qualitative, number of clients, number of loans outstanding, amount of loans, who attended the meeting, client retention, how many partners, how many countries, how many donors. We have categories of donors and the retention of our donors and staff and retention of staff. And we pretty much really have very smart people that have put metrics down, and we measure to the last dollar, budget, performance against budget, and so on. What we discovered recently is that you have all that information, it informs your decision, but what does it do to the people that you serve? What does it do to the men and women that live in those countries? What does it do to the donor that wants to know what's happening? And what does it do for the Hope staff that actually do that work all day long? And we discovered that what we want to measure now is impact. And it's difficult to measure impact, but at least we created a Hope quotient, and we have 4 key areas that we look at. In addition to all the information that is coming in, the figures that are coming in on pretty much everything. How is it impacting lives spiritually? How is it impacting personal lives? Is dignity being restored? And how do you measure that? So we created a Hope quotient. It's a set of questions that we have independent people go out in the field and ask that list of questions. We have our development reps sit with our donors and go through questions and find out, how is this actually impacting your life? So yeah, you have what you measure, and everything is pretty important to us. And so we try and measure everything.
Yeah. And this gets us to, in this conversation, we tend to measure inputs, outcomes, and impact. And for the longest time, we just simply measured inputs. How many volunteer experiences did we have? And then we started, outcomes. How many people did we feed? And I'm describing this because the whole world has kind of been on this journey to understand that as we measure things, we've got to close the loop in our thinking again. And the ultimate thing is not how many people you fed or how many people you put into volunteer experiences, but did you change the quality of life long term for the people that you're working for? And again, like everything else that we've been talking about, this is the calculus of compassion. It's not simple anymore. There's not an easy rubric or there's not an easy algorithm that tells you how to get to impact. It's only as we keep stepping into this space and bringing smarter people into it, and a different kind of person, people who like spreadsheets and algorithms and things that I can't even pronounce. Those are the folks that help us get to the difference between impact and that kind of stuff. Eric?
Yeah. Well, we're kind of the odd duck here in the mix of being kind of a Kingdom Connections ministry that is really excited about sustainability and transformation. So for us as an organization, of course, we measure and track a lot of things, and but I want to bring it back to the nonprofit that's focused on, specifically laser focused on sustainability and transformation too. But for us, I like to think of it that two specific words and draw a delineation here between measure and track. Because, and I'm not saying this is the only way to think of it, this is how I think of it. There are goals that you set and there are things that are related to things that you can control. Things that yourself or your organization, you're putting yourself on the hook for delivering these things. And we measure those things because those are clear goals, I guess you would say, that are to be met by what we plan to do. So we would measure those things, but then there are those other things that are out of our control. things that really depend on the response from the other person, or how God works, and all of that together, how God's working through the people and how they respond. It's out of your control individually and as an organization. But we still want to track those things. But I think sometimes we put ourselves in an awkward bind if we feel like we are measuring against a goal that's set about something that's out of our control. So that's sort of a lens that I kind of think through these things. But it seems like that in this context, the things for a ministry that is focused on sustainability and transformation will be a lot focused on just that. And the challenge I think I see with that is that it takes so much time to really evaluate that. You can have a metric that deals with the next 6 months or the next year, and that's important, but to gauge whether something's fully sustainable most of the time takes longer than that. So I think we have to have that long-term perspective, but to measure those things that are sustainable is that whatever the work is that's being done, is it able to continue on without the involvement of the organization or Western resources or whatever the other factors are that are involved, and continue on really well and accomplish what it's supposed to accomplish. So that's the sustainable part. And the transformation part, of course, we can all list things that would relate to that: life change, people being lifted out of poverty, both physical and spiritual poverty, becoming followers of Christ, and those types of things. But those are the things that I think are tough to put ourselves on the hook for as goals or metrics, in my opinion, as much as, hey, let's track those and celebrate that, what God does when we are accomplishing the things we put ourselves on the hook to do as a ministry.
Okay. Someone else? Florence?
Sure. At a personal level, just what my experience was going from medical practice and working for UN organizations in development and then stepping into missions. I felt at a personal level that I was leaving to go to something that's higher, that's of more value, that's of eternal value. And I usually would challenge myself that I don't want just to be a good doctor. I don't want to be involved in something that UNICEF can do, or something that can be done by a group that does not know Christ. I felt coming into it to be of eternal value, to impact at a level that would only take a believer to impact. So to be intentional with, we're not just going to reduce prevalence of disease or incidence, we are going to do something that's bigger than that. And it's looking for what is that's bigger, that's kingdom. So we measure a lot of things, has been said, but it's asking ourselves, so what difference is it making from any other organization that's doing the same things? The other thing that I could say differently in this would be, we don't just measure output. An example would be just what we said we will deliver through a proposal. We don't just measure that output, but more the outcome of, because this happened, so what? We went in to resettle street children. They're being resettled, 250, so what? What's the outcome? What is that doing to the church? What is it doing to the community? We went out to accomplish an objective in education. So this number have been enrolled. They've gone through training. That's an output. So what? How many of those will get jobs? How many of those will transform others? So it's to look at the impact beyond just the output or the outcome. I think the other thing that always just keeps me thinking is, what will be the stewardship, the accountability, the fact that we carry to our partners, we carry to our boards, we make known to the people who hold us accountable. And how can they understand the things that we are measuring, and how does that translate to them to hold us to account, and for us to be good stewards of the things that we've been given. Moving from output to outcome, but most importantly, what's the eternal value, what's the impact, and how is that impacting, especially the communities where we serve, the local church being transformed, the number of people beginning to come to church, sort of measuring those measurements that have kingdom impact than just the obvious outcomes of poverty reduction.
Pass it, and Lindsay, it's down to you and Justin, so chime in. I mean, and we gave them the option to participate in this. They're not leading a not-for-profit, but maybe to talk about what you do measure or what you think maybe the church should be measuring. Either one of those would be fine. Thoughts?
Yeah, so with everything we do at our firm, we always say, how do you define success? We never do anything without defining success because we're going to hold ourselves and the intention and purpose of what we're doing to that measure of success. Because we want to know, did we achieve something or did we not? If we didn't, awesome. These are the things that happened. We need to adjust course so that we can succeed. Or we did succeed, so let's take a moment to rejoice and get excited and be able to know what we're doing and to be able to articulate that. And so I think when talking about metrics, it's first going, how do we define success? Because you can get lost in the amount of variables you track. You can get lost in the amount of information that's cool to know, but not necessarily relevant or worth the resources when those resources could be allocated somewhere else. So first defining success and then saying, how do we track that? And the efforts it takes to track it, does it make sense with the overarching goals of the organization or the mission of the organization?
Justin, you're the last one, buddy.
We use measurements all the time. We measure everything. Beyond the first step of defining success and defining our objectives, we move into what we call a measure and analyze stage, where we measure all these different things, and without this step, we don't feel that we can successfully come up with solutions or controls in the future. So it's a very critical piece of what we do, and we measure, so when we can track our impact, not just in our due diligence, but as a business process that we use. We have different measurements in everything that we do to see if we're on the right track, see if we're having the type of impact that we are seeking to have in our objectives, and if not, then we can know when a good time is to stop that project and to move into something else. So without good data, we can't do good business. So measurement's critical. It's the first thing that we do after defining a problem is go into measurement phase.
So it's much easier, I would suggest, to measure in the business world because you've got balance sheets and profit and loss sheets, and it's kind of some bottom line. If you kind of go to the doing well by doing good and that kind of stuff, then you've got a double bottom line or triple bottom line. But it's far more complicated to figure out what the end goal is in the not-for-profit world and in the church world. And so, to what end and how do we define what success is? And so that's a tough one to do, to quantify. Any thoughts? Any questions? I want to. Yeah, Dennis.
So Dennis is saying, and I'm going to keep it going here. Dennis is saying sometimes metrics can be a hindrance to the goal.
I'm just great, and I believe in metrics and trying to figure out as a pastor and involved in our community how we do that. But time, the human spirit is it's mysterious, it's elusive, it's fluid, and so trying to measure at the end of the day that kind of impact on the human spirit, on a human being, is really kind of difficult. Like, say, you can measure houses and all these things. But that's the challenge in the body of Christ. And I think I heard my brother in the end talking about that a little bit. But so another big issue in my mind is big question mark is the issue of time, right? What's the valid time? We measure everything along the way, but what is the appropriate time for a goal, right? Mm-hmm. to implement. In other words, you're implementing something to try to achieve something. The challenge for all of us is the issue of time. Enough time, not enough time. Do we adjust? Do we do something else? Or does this take a lot of time and it's hard to measure it? But could it be often that maybe sometimes the metrics keep us from the goal because the metrics say to us, no, we're not on the right track. Does that make sense? Or maybe it doesn't. I don't know. But
So
as a pastor, that's a part of the challenge, I think, that I face and others, the issue of longevity and how long you stay at something.
Maybe I can just start us on responding to that. Like from the beginning, we've mentioned from here severally that we define what is success. And that success could be defined by a strategic plan. That for the next 5 years, this is the direction we're going to go. And a strategic plan would, be broken down further to these are the objectives. And these are the measurable indicators that we are accomplishing that. Again, that being to hold us to account, whether it's through the board or through the senior leadership team, that those indicators are important, like to see we planned to accomplish this in this strategic period. Where are we in that? Should we be adjusting? So it's all tracking where we are going with the strategic plan. In the strategic plan, it's time measurable. So like there are timely factors there. So if it's something you needed to accomplish in 3 months, then at the 3-month mark, these are things that you need to check in. So all that timing is part of that. And I would say within a strategic period, that's easy to track. I think it's asking ourselves, like, we've moved on, it's 10 years later, what happened because we implemented that strategic plan? Like, how can we go back to say, was that worth the 10 years that we lived? And I think that's where the impact indicators come in. And those would be defined by what was really your intention in going into that community, like what would that success look like? And it could be in the health indices, or it could be in the economic indices or the education indices. So it's going back to those and saying, what happened to those indices 10 years later? Has disease gone down? It's looking at those things. So the time and the indicator you use really depends on what was your objective in the first place? What was your strategic goal? And what were the smart indicators that you put in there to accomplish at some given times?
One of the reasons we measure, it's because we want efficiencies and we want to improve productivity. We want to expand the work that we do. If I just take an example of one of the metrics that we measure, it's the cost of serving one client per year. And there's so much that goes into getting that report. How much money did you put in? How many staff are involved? How many loans went out? What was the profit on those loans? What was the investment in productive assets? And all that goes into letting you know that in year X, with X number of Y number of clients, your cost per client was ABCD. In the question and the discussion on sustainability, if that cost per client remains the same, you're creating dependency. If it continues to diminish, you're gaining. And if you pulled out today, there are some people that would still go ahead out of poverty and not return. So there's so much that goes into measuring, but unless you measure what you're doing, it's like you're blindly operating. Another thing is that you're probably assuming that you're being successful, like they mentioned. So for us, it started with metrics. What do we measure? And then when you get that information, how do you use it? Now, in many cases, the information we receive informs us, informs our decisions, informs our expansion plans, and so on. But we discover that unless that message, that information, that metrics goes back to the people we serve, then it's only one-sided. And if you want impact, you want someone to realize, yes, my first loan was $50, not that they will forget, but their first loan was $50, and today their loan is $1,000, and they've moved from 2 products to about 10 products. Every time you take back that information and then you begin to discuss sustainability, they're willing to listen because they're seeing the journey from where they started. So the metrics that we have should be profitable for us as we create them, but there has to be a feedback loop to where you're getting that information. And unless that feedback loop is there, then you probably have a one-sided use of that metrics. And then because we did that for a long time, we got to a place, yes, we've been successful, we've gone to the X number of countries we wanted, we have these clients, our cost per member is reducing, but are we having impact? And then we create another way of measuring that. And this work is dynamic. A few years from now, we're going to be talking about something else that is beyond metrics, that is beyond impact. And that's the beauty of the work that we do. It's never boring.
Great question, great. Anybody else have a question? It is interesting, and the conversation about metrics has come a long way in the last 10 years. And Dennis, you're a pastor. And you know, in our pastoral role, we are used to seeing we're used to seeing the individuals. I mean, I deal with individuals as a pastor. And yet you're hearing up here conversations about whole communities and another concept of indices. And that takes a long view as well as a high view. And it's in measuring indices and longitudinal studies over long periods of time that you begin to see the long-term impact of something. And some of the tension that we live in this world, because the church is a pastoral environment, is, and I hear this in your question, is when do we give up on an individual, or when do we push the program faster than the individuals within this arena can acclimate to it? And I'm sure that's always a tension. There's always individuals that are not part of the success stories of the indices, that are not part of the success stories of and how long do we hold on? How long do we keep doing something before we start to wrestle with the efficiencies that are involved in that? And that's not an easy decision to make, I'm sure. But I think that's part of the tension. Keith?
Well, I think we all measure statistics as we have to. The danger is, how do we interpret those statistics? And a lot of times we'll get visiting church groups who will apply what they've done in 4 or 5 days to our statistics and come up with an entirely different read than what we as an organization will take. I've seen groups go down and distribute eyeglasses. It's wonderful to help people who can't see. And they'll go back and talk about the 500 people that can now see that couldn't. But what they didn't see was those people, after they left, trading the eyeglasses back and forth because they really couldn't see out of them, or the frames were broken, or they didn't like the color of them. The same with medical groups. I've seen medical groups go down and have lines of 200 or 300 people waiting, and you got 5 or 6 doctors standing in a row, and the lines come through, and everybody gets 2 or 3 pills from this one, and this one checks their blood pressure and temperature and gives them something else, and that one gives them something else, and they go home and talk about the 1,000 people they treated and made well last week. But they didn't see all these people trading pills because I want the blue ones, I don't want the pink ones. And what color do you have? Oh, I want one of those. And so it isn't just statistics, it's translating those statistics, interpreting them.
Yeah. And I think we're going to draw this to a closer, but the bigger point in all of this is that, like everything else, it is complicated. And there was a time not so many years ago in which we kind of had this feeling that if you could explain it, then God must not be a part of it. That what we wanted to see are those things that have no explanation other than God must have shown up. And I think we're getting past that right now, is that we want to be able to explain the things. God's always going to work in the mysteries and so forth, but if we want to truly understand the impact, we're going to have to take a long view at the things that we're doing. We're going to have to continue to ask ourselves the questions, really, what's really happening here? And are we getting the kind of impact long-term that we want within our neighborhoods that we're working in and the various things that we're working on? So I appreciate, the wealth of information here and what folks are doing to try to figure out how to measure long-term impact, I think can only be of value to the church long-term as we, as churches, try to figure out how we can be a part of that, as well as measure the things that we're doing within our congregations as well. So I appreciate you giving us a little bit of time to think about the whole idea of metrics. Would you give them a hand?